Welcome to Think Big with Dan and Qasim. Join hosts Dan Melnick and Qasim Masood as they explore big ideas, limitless possibilities, and engage with visionaries, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who dare to dream big, get inspired, motivated, and find practical tips for personal growth. Think big, dream bigger, and ignite your potential.
Welcome to Think Big with Dan and Qasim. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us where you live and what you do.
Yes. Hey, Dan. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Denise Edwards. I live in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, in Europe. And I am the founder and CEO of SaaSlaunch.io, where we help pre-seed, seed, and Series A startups with fundraising.
Awesome. So how did you get into this business in the first place?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. So my background, I have been an AE or an account executive, as they call it, or a sales rep for many years since I actually finished my master's degree. And I actually started working in tech sales back in the day. And so I worked for companies such as LinkedIn, companies such as Oracle, but also smaller startups and scale-ups, just in the whole tech field. And so in 2018, I started my own business, which was a sales and marketing service for technology startups, because obviously I come from a sales background. And so I actually helped these smaller founders or these smaller startups and founders specifically with sales and marketing. And that actually transitioned into one of our clients asking us to help them with the fundraising side of things, because we were doing the sales and marketing for them. And at that time, I didn't know anything about fundraising. And so I had to obviously, go into my network, understand a little bit more of the fundraising process, but then also implement what we believed would be a great strategy moving forward. And so we helped them with fundraising from their side, and then other clients followed suit. And that's basically how we transitioned into kind of like the full fundraising cycle. And that's what I've been doing over the past couple of years.
Awesome. So in terms of your clientele, are they mostly in Europe or here in the States, or what does that look like for you?
Region. Yeah. So I would say it's usually namers, so North America, and then Europe, Middle East, and Africa, as we see it, we say EMEA. That's kind of like the biggest chunk of the clients that we have. We have less clients in APAC, so Asia Pacific, but majority of the clientele is namers, so North America and EMEA. And I also have to caveat, we're also getting a lot more kind of like inflow from LATAM, so Latin America, which is also very interesting. It's a great, great, great market to be in as well.
For sure. And then in terms of the companies that work with you, obviously, if you're helping them raise money, I'm sure many of them are early stage. So
yeah.
How do you kind of work with that? Because when people are very early on, they might not have so much budget. So do you kind of take a certain percentage from that money that you help them raise, or how do you even kind of vet those folks to where it makes sense for you and it makes sense for them as well?
Yeah, so we have different service packages. So we do have an upfront fee. So we have a service fee where we actually help them. And it depends on which stage they're at, because we have, for example, for the pre-seed kind of like founders, we have different types of, let's say, packages where you can actually go from, a very simple package where we actually help you and teach you how to actually do the fundraising on your own. So as a founder itself. And then we have at the seed stage, usually they do have some budget. And so we can do the done for you service, which is fundraising on their behalf. And then we do the whole fundraising process on their behalf. So there's different packages, really depending on which stage they're at. We're actually opening up now an academy where, as a founder for a lower budget ticket, you can, have a membership per month and then actually, learn about fundraising, have a community, have Q&As. And I think all of the things that, founders need in this stage. So that's something that we're opening up very soon.
Awesome. So in terms of later stage or even Series A, et cetera, if they've already raised some money, obviously that you guys have the service where you're kind of helping them, but what does that look like? Because obviously, or it seems to me, it's many founders have to be sort of involved in that process. They're on the calls, they're speaking with investors. So how does that work? Are you on the calls with them, or just to make sure that they can raise that money?
Yeah, exactly. So the process, what that actually looks like is that we focus on, and again, depending on the stage, let's look at the seed stage, right? Founders already have some revenue, they have a product, and they just sometimes they need to close their round. So we have like a client now currently that is in the middle of their raise and they just need to close the round, right? That's something that we can do. We can also start at the beginning where, they're really wanting to start fundraising, but they don't have like the assets or the capabilities. And so what we actually look at is, okay, how far are you? You usually have a pitch deck. Okay, can we refine that? Can we look at how we can actually refine the value proposition and all that good stuff? We have those deliverables in place, and then we actually reach out to investors. So whether it's through our network, whether it's through, sources that we have, other partners, databases that we've built all over the years, that's where we actually source our investors from, and then we actually reach out on their behalf. Now, what many founders do is that, they think that, okay, you reach out to investors and that's it. You just need to have a list and that's it. But there's a lot of things that need to go in place. So you have a diligent process. You need to know how to communicate with these investors to make your story enticing. You need to understand that traction is not only financial traction, it's also what updates can you give these investors so that these investors can actually see the trajectory of your growth, if that makes any sense. And so all of those elements, that's something that we work on and that we then start reaching out on the behalf of the clients to these investors. And then we set up those meetings. We help them actually also through the meetings. We're not in the meetings itself because investors obviously want to see that you're the founder, but we do train you on that. So some founders, what we've seen is if they come from kind of like a technological background, then it's sometimes hard to kind of communicate the value proposition, or how do you actually entice, the founders with kind of like a nice storytelling way. And so we train and help those founders as well and coach them on that. And then basically they hop on the meetings and then we help them close as well, whether it's in kind of like negotiation process and term sheets and things like that. We always say when you're at the term sheets, obviously you need to have a lawyer in place, but we can provide you just feedback from our experience and what to think about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And then in terms of meeting with investors, obviously things have changed a lot since COVID. It's a lot more remote, like we're on this call virtually. So what is kind of your recommendation, or what are your thoughts about, meeting in person versus remotely? What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. I had a conversation with a potential client last week, and a big one. And me and our consultant, we have a senior consultant, we had this conversation as well. And so usually the meetings are virtual. That's just in general. That's very easy for both sides, right? What happens is when it becomes, let's say, physical, like it's in a physical place or a physical office, that's usually when you're closer to kind of like the term sheet. So we had, for example, we closed a deal for this company out of Portugal. And so they had meetings online up until they went into kind of like the term sheets. And then the founder flew to San Francisco to the VC office and had kind of like their discussions and term sheets there. So probably at the first start, it's going to be virtual unless you're in the same city of the investor. Then obviously you can do it, in an office or whatsoever, but it's usually virtual. And then when it comes to closer to kind of like the deal, then it's meeting in person.
So is that part advantageous, right? Because it seems like, obviously I'm here in the US, so many founders do move to the San Francisco area to raise money. So from your perspective, would you say that helps, or would you recommend that, like, if it's possible?
I think either way, it's great, but not all founders can move to San Francisco. And we've seen from our experience that you don't need to per se be in San Francisco or in one of those regions where you have a lot of VCs, or at least investors. You can also do that virtually, but you need to have a process in place and you need to understand the process and you need to have that diligence. And just because there's many moving parts within the fundraising process, and that needs to be it needs to be in a certain sequence to make sure that, the chips fall in your favor. And so that's where that comes in, but you don't need to per se be in kind of like, it's nice to be in that area, don't get me wrong. And I'm not saying that it's not, but, you can also do a lot from where you're at, as long as you know the process, as long as you have the sequences, as long as you have the diligence and know how to communicate, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, 100%. And then in terms of when you're working with your clients or when you're having these conversations, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see founders make when they're trying to actually go and raise money?
I think the biggest one is it's also mindset a lot that we're working on with the founders. And so I would say kind of like having the mindset of thinking, oh, I'm just going to, make a list of 100 investors and just reach out to them. That's one thing that I'm seeing a lot that does not work. I mean, outreach does work, but it's a process, it's a sequence, it's understanding those sequences basically. And so I would say that would be one. Also, what we're seeing is the amounts, sometimes the amounts raised. So sometimes you have founders that, are pre-revenue, but they want to raise, X amount, which is quite a huge amount for where you're at this stage. And so that is also something to really take and consider because investors that specifically at the pre-seed stage, let's say if you want, and it depends again on the industry, what type of product you're developing, because sometimes certain products that you're developing do need have a lot of development costs associated with them. So there's many factors that you have to take into account. But again, like we can't have like huge amounts of funds raised where you're at a pre-seed stage. So those are things to really consider. I would also say, as I mentioned, the outreach, I think those are kind of like the bigger, broader things. Yeah, I think I would say that. If I come up with more, then I'll definitely share. But those are the major two things. It's a lot around the mindset that we're actually teaching these founders, like how to actually think about fundraising, right? It's not only about like raising it and then having that money to invest. It's also what's the longer term vision that you have? What's the impact that you want to make in the world, right? And that's kind of like that, yeah, that coaching and consulting that comes in that part as well.
100%. Yeah. And then in terms of, you're kind of just talking about physical location, and obviously investors are different in different, parts of the
Yeah.
world. So what are you seeing now, or like what are some of the trends when it comes to like investors in Europe versus here in the States and other countries, in terms of like how much money you can raise, or even just how some of these folks work in these different parts of the world?
Yeah, what we're seeing is that investors, let's do two regions. Let's do the US and let's do Europe, right? And then Europe has obviously different countries. But just overall and in just a general sense. So what we're seeing is like raising in Europe is, I would say that European investors are just more traditional. So that if you compare ticket sizes, like ticket sizes in Europe in general, across the board are just smaller than compared to the US. And that's something where a lot of, for example, EU founders want to have, let's say, an entity in the US because they understand that kind of like the ticket sizes there are bigger. And also kind of like the mindset is also different because again, you have traditional European investors, a little bit more of a traditional mindset, nothing wrong with that. But in the US, it's more think big and what can we do and really looking at the mission and vision. I was, for example, the last few months I was in Miami and I met with a lot of investors. I had a few events there. And so I spoke with these people. And so I could really see kind of like the difference between when I go to events in Europe and when I go to events here in the US, it's just a different ball game. It's really about like, what's the vision, what's the mission, etc. Again, Europe is the same, but ticket sizes are just smaller. It's just more traditional. And I think it's more from just our perspective. I think European investors are probably more risk averse. And so, yeah, I think that's the biggest difference right now. And what we're also seeing when it comes to investments, we're seeing a little bit of a trend where there's kind of like more of an uptick in potential investments, whereas maybe last year it was a little bit more difficult to raise capital. Now we're seeing a little bit more of the trend of, okay, investors are opening up more, et cetera, but that's from our perspective. So.
For sure. And then obviously now we just started Q2 of 2025. So in terms of your business, what are some of your biggest goals and objectives for the rest of this year?
So one of the goals that we have is we are opening up that academy. So we call it the SaaS Launch Academy. This is basically so we have the services part, right? where we actually do the fundraising on the clients we have. We have the coaching part, but we also want to do a lower ticket offer where we can actually help founders actually teach this whole fundraising process, know the diligent steps that you need to take, the sequences, have all the tools in place, have the Q&As, like weekly Q&A calls for any, let's say, questions that they might have, and just like an academy where founders can come and then basically, not only learn about fundraising, but really implement that. And so that's something that we're launching pretty soon. On the services side, of course, we want to focus on bigger clients that are raising higher amounts. And so that's something that we're focused on. And to be very honest, Dan, like our vision is to actually become the kind of like hub for SaaS companies. So the hub where you can actually, not only get fundraising advice, not only, get help with fundraising if that's the stage that you're at, but also education. And then also we have partners that we work with, big partners, international partners that we work with that also are connected to non-dilutive investments, right? So we can always kind of like funnel like these startups to, okay, these partners. We have partners that help us with MVP building if that's something that the company needs. We have partners in the sales and marketing. So we just want to become the SaaS funding hub, but then have all these connections where you can just come to us. It's a one-stop shop, and we will help you with other things that you need, basically, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's awesome. So, I mean, obviously that you've been doing it for some time. So if you could go back in time to before you started this business, what is the one biggest piece of advice that you wish you knew?
Honestly, I think the advice that I would give myself is because before I'm still a perfectionist person. So I want to do things in the best way possible, but that's not always the case. And so I think in the beginning, I was very hard on myself. If it's not perfect, then it's kind of like, it's not the best. And the advice that I would then give my, I guess, younger self, if I can say it like that, is to just, follow the process and have faith that everything that you're doing is getting you to where you're at. And so I think that spiritual element, and that's the number one thing for me in my life, that's something that I would kind of like reiterate, I think, in those moments, as in like, you don't have to be a perfectionist, but just, follow the steps, do the best that you can. And also have faith that these steps are actually showing you where you need to go to, if that makes any sense.
No, yeah, it definitely does. And then in terms of, like if somebody watching this, right, wanted to work with you or wanted to find you, do you mind sharing your social media, website, email, just whatever contact information?
Yeah, for sure. So you can find me on deniseedwards.co on my personal website. You can find me on my socials. On LinkedIn, it's Denise Edwards. And there's probably a lot of Denise Edwards on LinkedIn. So if you put Denise Edwards and then my company name SaaS Launch, which is SaaSLaunch.io. You will find me on LinkedIn as well. But on all other socials, deniseedwards.co, which is on YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, everything. So you'll find definitely my content there.
Well, Denise, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Dan, for having me.